Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the word normal meant something truly, deeply unhinged. We're talking about Victorian England, that buttoned up, lace-curtained, seemingly proper era that was secretly one of the most bizarre, disgusting and absurdly dangerous times to be alive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a massive, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and frankly, you have excellent taste in historical horror. Your suggestions are the engine that keeps this whole thing running, and I mean that sincerely. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's somehow always 2 in the morning for someone. You can also find us now on Spotify, links in the description, in case you'd prefer to let the Victorians haunt you through your earbuds on the commute. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan, get yourself horizontal, and tuck those feet in, not because of rats this time, but because of what the Victorians did to feet, and we'll get to that. But first, let's pause and ask ourselves a few important questions. Did Victorians really put arsenic in their wallpaper and think that was fine? Did they actually carry dead hair around in lockets as a romantic gesture? Was there a point in history where a piano leg was considered too sexy to leave uncovered? Why did they think photographing corpses was a lovely family activity? Could you survive a dinner party where the table centerpiece was a man's skull? Were children regularly given cocaine for a cough? And did anyone raise so much as a single eyebrow? How did a woman get dressed in the morning if getting dressed took 45 minutes and required a second human being and a corset strong enough to crack a rib? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1852. You have a top hat, a chest infection, a handful of arsenic lace sweets, and approximately 0 reasons to feel confident about your odds. Welcome to Victorian England. Try not to breathe too deeply. Let's talk about your walls. Not in a poetic, introspective way, in a you are being slowly poisoned by your decor way. The Victorians had a deep, almost romantic obsession with a shade of green. So vivid, so gloriously bold, it looked like someone had wrung out an emerald. They called it Shields green, and they put it absolutely everywhere. Wallpaper, curtains, candles, fake flowers, children's toys, ball gowns, cake decorations. The problem, and it was a fairly significant one, was that this magnificent green was made using arsenic, not trace amounts. Substantial, enthusiastic quantities of arsenic, cheerfully printed onto the surfaces of every room in the house and left there to quietly off-gas into the lungs of the entire family. Victorian households reported mysterious headaches, nausea, fatigue, and a persistent sense of being unwell, that doctors blamed on everything from moral weakness to bad air. They weren't entirely wrong about the bad air part. They were just wrong about where it was coming from. The culprit was a mold, specifically a fungus that colonized damp wallpaper and converted the arsenic compounds in the dye into a volatile gas called trimethylarsine, which then drifted through the room in concentrations that were low enough to be invisible and high enough to make everyone in the house feel inexplicably terrible on a permanent basis. Doctors visited. Doctors puzzled. Doctors occasionally prescribed a change of air, which worked, because the change of air meant you had temporarily left your house, which was the actual problem. Now, to be fair to the Victorians, some of them did suspect the wallpaper. As early as 1858, a chemist named William Odling stood up at a public meeting and pointed directly at the green dye as a likely cause of household illness. He was heard politely and then largely ignored, because the wallpaper was beautiful and the illness was vague, and redecorating was expensive and inconvenient. This is, if you think about it, a very recognizable human response to inconvenient information. The scale of the problem was significant. By the 1870s, it was estimated that somewhere in the region of 100 million square yards of arsenic-dyed wallpaper had been produced in Britain alone. That is not a small number. That is enough arsenic-laced wallpaper to cover a substantial portion of the country's interior walls, which is, in fact, what had happened. And it wasn't just wallpaper. The same dye appeared in the green baize covering card tables, in the artificial flowers women wore in their hair at parties, in the tissue paper used to wrap confectionery. You could, on a reasonably fashionable Victorian evening out, be exposed to arsenic via your walls, your centrepiece, the flowers in your hostess's hair, and the paper wrapped around the sweets on the table. The campaign to remove arsenic from dyes was slow, contested, and ultimately only partially successful. Manufacturers argued there was no definitive proof. Retailers argued demand was too high to stop. And fashionable consumers continued to buy the green wallpaper because it was genuinely, undeniably beautiful, and the headaches could be attributed to any number of things. William Morris, yes, the William Morris, the iconic designer whose floral wallpaper patterns remain beloved to this day, used arsenic green dyes in several of his designs well into the 1880s. Despite mounting evidence of the hazard and despite the fact that his own family owned a copper and arsenic mining company, which may or may not have influenced his relaxed attitude toward the whole situation, the arsenic wallpaper problem was eventually resolved less by regulation and more by fashion moving on. A new era of synthetic dyes arrived, the green fell out of vogue, and future generations simply replaced the old paper with new paper and thought nothing more about it. The headaches, presumably, cleared up. The walls looked lovely, and no one asked too many questions about what the previous generation had been breathing for 40 years. In the Victorian era, grief wasn't just an emotion, it was a craft project. When a loved one died, it was not considered morbid, unusual, or in any way alarming to take a lock of their hair, braid it, press it under glass, and wear it around your neck for the rest of your natural life. In fact, it was expected. Mourning jewellery was a booming industry. You could have hair woven into rings, brooches, bracelets, earrings, or elaborate framed displays hung on your parlour wall like a beloved portrait, except the portrait was made of dead person. Jewellers offered catalogues, families compared pieces, and if you were particularly committed to the aesthetic, you might commission a piece that combined hair from multiple deceased relatives into a single arrangement, which is either deeply touching or extremely unsettling depending on your perspective, and also on whether any of them died of something contagious. The practice had roots that predated Victoria, but the Queen herself turned mourning into a national art form. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria did not simply grieve, she institutionalized it. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She slept with a cast of Albert's hand beside her. She had his clothes laid out on his side of the bed every morning for decades, and she insisted that hot water for shaving be brought to his room each day, as though he might yet appear and require it. A nation that already had strong feelings about the correct expression of bereavement took one look at their queen and concluded that they had, if anything, been underselling it. Hair, specifically, held a particular significance. It was the part of a person that survived longest. It didn't decay. It didn't change. It remained in some essential way the person, tangible, warm in colour, recognisably theirs. A lock of a child's hair pressed into a locket was a way of keeping the child close after everything else was gone, and given Victorian child mortality rates, this was not a comfort that only a few families required. The craftsmanship involved could be extraordinary. Hair was braided into intricate patterns, woven into floral motifs, coiled into miniature landscapes, or twisted into fine chains indistinguishable from gold wire at first glance. Professional hair workers, a recognised trade, could produce pieces of genuine technical beauty. Ladies' magazines published instructions for amateur versions, turning haircraft into a domestic skill alongside embroidery and watercolour. Another quiet afternoon activity for women, in an era when quiet afternoon activities were both expected and mandatory. Men wore it too, in signet rings with a compartment behind the stone, or in watch fobs, or in small brooches worn close to the body. The sentiment crossed class lines. A factory worker might have a single lock knotted into a simple frame, just as a duchess might commission an elaborate brooch in jet and gold. The grief was the same. The budget varied. What strikes a modern observer, beyond the obvious strangeness, is how direct it was. There was no metaphor here, no flowers standing in for the loss, no symbolic object gesturing at absence. It was the person, physically. You wore the person, you carried the person, And the Victorian world looked at this practice and found it not strange but proper, a correct and dignified acknowledgement that some losses do not diminish and should not be asked to. Whether your modern self would have worn a brooch made of your grandmother's hair is a question worth sitting with quietly in the dark. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a remarkable place. If you were tired, there was something for that. If you were anxious, there was something for that. If your baby was teething and wouldn't stop crying at 3 a.m, and honestly, who could blame the baby? There was absolutely something for that. That something was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, available over the counter at any pharmacy, marketed to adults and children alike with the casual confidence of a brand selling flavoured throat lozenges. It was prescribed for headaches, menstrual cramps, coughs, diarrhea, grief, hysteria, insomnia, and what Victorian doctors cheerfully described as nervousness. Mothers dabbed it on their gums, nurses gave it to infants, and the general public purchased it by the bottle, took it by the spoonful, and then wondered why they felt a little foggy and couldn't quite face the day without it. The dosing instructions, where they existed at all, were approximate in a way that should have given someone pause. Bottles instructed users to take a few drops, which is not a unit of measurement that inspires confidence when the active ingredient is opium. The strength varied between batches and between manufacturers. A dose that did nothing for a habitual user could send a first-time user into respiratory distress, a fact that was known to pharmacists and generally not printed on the label. Thomas de Quincey published his Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, describing in considerable sensory detail what it felt like to take laudanum recreationally and then find that you could not stop. The book was widely read, somewhat scandalous, and had essentially no effect on laudanum's popularity, which continued to grow throughout the century. Elizabeth Barrett Browning took it for years. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was famously dependent on it. Wilkie Collins, who wrote some of the most gripping Victorian detective fiction, consumed it in such quantities that he eventually claimed to see a doppelganger of himself following him around, which is the kind of symptom that might suggest a reassessment of the treatment plan. Working-class families used laudanum for a specific and not entirely unsympathetic purpose: keeping children quiet. A woman working a factory shift for 12 hours had, in many cases, no alternative childcare, and no way to bring the child to work. A small amount of laudanum in a teething baby's gum, or a slightly larger amount in what was sold as a soothing syrup, produced a sedated infant who would not cry, and would not require immediate attention. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for teething children, contained morphine and alcohol, and was sold across Britain and America for decades. The label described it as perfectly harmless. It was not perfectly harmless. The eventual decline of over-the-counter opiates came not through immediate moral reckoning but through slow legislative pressure. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required that certain drugs, including opium, be sold only by registered pharmacists, which was a start, though it did not restrict who could buy them or in what quantities. Full regulation came considerably later. In the meantime, the Victorian household coped with its various aches, anxieties, and sleepless infants the way it coped with most things, with chemical assistance, minimal questioning, and a firm belief that if something was available for purchase at a reputable establishment, it was probably fine. It was not always fine, but the babies did stop crying, and in a household with thin walls, long hours, and no concept of parental leave, that counted for something. Here's something the Victorians did that will require you to sit with it for a moment. When someone died, they sometimes propped the body up, dressed it in its best clothes, arranged it in a natural-looking pose, and then gathered the remaining living family members around it for a photograph. This was called post-mortem photography, and it was not fringe behaviour. It was a mainstream, widely practiced, socially acceptable way of preserving the memory of the deceased, particularly children, at a time when photography was expensive and many people had no other images of their loved ones. Photographers offered specific services for it. Studios were equipped for it. Families scheduled sessions around it. Some photos are remarkably peaceful. A child arranged as if sleeping, hands folded, expression serene. Others are more ambitious, with the deceased seated upright, eyes propped open with small devices, posed between living relatives who are all smiling as though nothing unusual is happening, because to them, nothing unusual was. Photography arrived in the 1830s, and for most of the Victorian era it was expensive enough that a sitting was a significant occasion rather than a casual one. Many working-class families had their photograph taken once, maybe twice in a lifetime, at a specific event that justified the cost. For families who had lost a child before any photograph existed, which was common given the mortality rates, the death of that child was, counterintuitively, the moment at which a photograph became both possible and necessary. The portrait that would have been taken in life was taken instead in death. This was grief doing the best it could with the tools available. The techniques photographers developed for the purpose were practical and, in their own way, thoughtful. Stands were designed to hold a body upright. Eyelids were propped, or, in some cases, eyes were painted onto the closed lids in the finished photograph to make the subject appear awake. Poses were drawn from portraiture conventions, seated in a favourite chair, resting on a chaise, held by a parent. The surrounding family was arranged naturally, siblings on either side, a mother's hand on a shoulder, so that the image looked, from a certain angle and with a certain willingness to not look too closely, like a family portrait from a Sunday afternoon. Some photographers specialized in making it difficult to tell, others made no such effort, and the subjects of their images are unmistakably, evidently deceased, their faces grey, their posture maintained by visible means, the whole image carrying a quality of stillness that no living person possesses in quite the same way. The practice declined as photography became cheaper and more common. Once a family could afford to photograph their children while alive, the post-mortem portrait became less of a necessity. By the early 20th century it had become unusual, then rare, then the kind of thing people came across in old boxes of family photographs and didn't quite know what to make of. What you do know, looking at them now, is that someone stood in a room that smelled of preserving chemicals and grief, arranged the person they loved into the best imitation of life they could manage, and asked a photographer to make it last. The technology was new. The impulse was not. People have always wanted to hold on. The Victorians just had a particularly literal method. Getting dressed in the Victorian era was less of a morning routine and more of an endurance test with a small audience. For women, the centerpiece of the whole production was the corset, a rigid, heavily boned contraption, laced tight enough to compress the waist by several inches, rearrange the internal organs into creative new configurations, and make deep breathing a theoretical rather than practical activity. This was not a secret. Victorian doctors wrote extensively about the physical damage caused by tight lacing, compressed livers, displaced stomachs, fractured lower ribs, difficulty breathing, chronic fainting. And in response to this rather conclusive evidence, fashionable Victorian women continued wearing corsets while also purchasing fainting couches, which were long, low, elegant pieces of furniture specifically designed to catch you when your clothing made you pass out. The fainting couch wasn't a quirk, it was infrastructure. To understand why the corset persisted in the face of mounting medical criticism, you have to understand what the corset represented in Victorian social logic. A small waist was not merely an aesthetic preference, it was evidence of moral character, self-restraint, discipline, refinement. A woman who laced tightly demonstrated that she was not the kind of woman who let herself go. The fact that the discipline involved was essentially a passive one, you simply wore the object, it did the restraining for you, was not considered to undermine the point. You still had to put it on every morning and endure it every day, which was its own kind of commitment. The tight-lacing debate divided Victorian society into two passionate camps. On one side, the anti-corset reformers, doctors, dress reformers, early feminists, who published pamphlets, letters to newspapers, and illustrated guides showing what corsets did to the internal architecture of the human torso. Some of these illustrations were genuinely alarming, showing ribs migrating, organs shifting, spines curving into shapes they were not designed to achieve. On the other side, women who wore corsets, and who wrote letters to fashion magazines defending them in terms that range from aesthetic to practical to, remarkably, medical, arguing that the support provided by a well-fitted corset was beneficial, not harmful, and that their doctors agreed. Some doctors did agree, which tells you something about the medical profession of the era. The getting dressed process beyond the corset was also simply enormous. A fully dressed, fashionable Victorian woman wore, in rough sequence, a chemise, drawers, a corset cover, a crinoline or bustle depending on the decade, a petticoat or several, a dress with its own internal structure, and a trained skirt behind, sleeves that required their own fitting and often their own internal support, a collar, a brooch, gloves, and a hat that needed to be pinned to the hair with hat pins long enough to be classified in a later era as a potential weapon. Undressing at the end of the day, with all of this in reverse, and the corset laces finally released, was described in Victorian diaries with a specificity that suggests it was one of the more physically satisfying moments of the day. The expansion of lungs suddenly permitted to fill completely, the spine permitted to resume its natural curvature, the slow, luxurious return to a body that was temporarily your own again. The fainting couch, at the end of all this, starts to seem less like a piece of furniture and more like a quiet act of mercy. The ideal Victorian complexion was pale, not just fair, not just light, but almost translucently white, as though you had been assembled entirely indoors from materials that had never encountered sunlight. And in pursuit of this ideal, Victorian women did things to their faces that would make a modern dermatologist physically leave the room. Lead-based foundation, called pearl powder or Venetian ceruse, was applied generously to the skin to achieve that ghostly brightness everyone was after. The lead absorbed into the skin over time, causing hair loss, skin lesions, tremors, and eventual organ damage. When women began showing symptoms of lead poisoning, doctors noted the deterioration with concern and sometimes recommended they use less powder. The women mostly did not. Separately, arsenic wafers, small tablets containing actual arsenic, were sold as complexion improvers, with the logic that arsenic suppressed blood flow to the skin's surface and kept it looking fashionably bloodless. The Victorian beauty industry was, in essence, a slow and decorative race to the bottom. The paleness preference had a logic to it, even if the methods for achieving it were catastrophically misguided. In a society where working outdoors in sun and weather was synonymous with agricultural labour and low social status, a pale complexion visually communicated leisure, wealth, and a life lived in drawing rooms. A woman who tanned was a woman who had to be outside. A woman who remained white was a woman who had somewhere comfortable to be. This distinction was considered important enough that generations of women poisoned themselves to preserve it. The lead powders had been in use for centuries before Victoria. Elizabeth I used them, and her portraits show a face of remarkable artificial whiteness that historians now attribute partly to the paint and partly to the cumulative lead exposure that made her later complexion increasingly difficult to manage without more. Paint. The Victorians inherited both the product and the logic, and continued applying both with dedication. Belladonna, deadly nightshade, was used as eye drops to dilate the pupils, making the eyes appear larger and more luminous, which was considered attractive. The side effects of regular belladonna use included blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and over time, damage to the eyes and optic nerve. Users were not always warned. The name belladonna, meaning beautiful woman in Italian, suggests that whoever coined it had their priorities sorted in a fairly specific order. Red lips were achieved through dyes and tints that sometimes contained mercury. Rouges for the cheeks used carmine, cochineal, or in cheaper preparations, compounds that irritated and eventually damaged the skin they were applied to. The fashionable Victorian woman, in her full cosmetic armour, was wearing a collection of substances that read, in retrospect, like a very specific kind of slow harm delivered in daily increments and framed as self-improvement. What makes it particularly remarkable is that by the mid-Victorian era, The connection between lead and illness was reasonably well established. The Victorians were not entirely ignorant of toxicology. They knew lead was dangerous in paint, in pipes, in food tins. They simply maintained a careful separation between that knowledge and the powder they applied to their faces every morning, in the same way that people maintain certain careful separations to this day between things they know and things they prefer to continue doing. The beauty industry has changed considerably since then. The specific poisons are different now. But the basic structure, here is a product that promises to make you more acceptable, and here is the small print you are invited not to read too carefully, has proven to be remarkably durable. Victorian dentistry operated on the basic principle that if something hurts badly enough, you remove it and deal with the consequences later. There was no anesthesia for most of the era. Ether didn't arrive until the 1840s, and even then it wasn't universally trusted or available, which meant that having a tooth pulled was exactly as horrifying as you're currently imagining, performed with iron instruments by a man who might also cut your hair. The result was that many Victorians simply lost their teeth, or had them pulled prophylactically before they had the chance to become a problem, in the same spirit with which someone might cancel plans before they have the chance to go badly. Wealthy Victorians replaced their missing teeth with dentures, which sounds more civilized until you learn where the teeth in those dentures came from. After major battles, particularly Waterloo in 1815, tooth hunters moved across the battlefields pulling teeth from the dead. These were cleaned, shaped, and sold to dentists, who used them to make dentures for paying customers. Waterloo teeth were, for a time, a specific, recognized product. The demand for human teeth exceeded what battlefields alone could supply. London's body snatchers, resurrectionists they preferred, who dug up fresh graves to sell the bodies to medical schools, routinely removed the teeth first. Since teeth could be sold separately and quickly without the legal complications that came with a full corpse, workhouses and hospitals were approached directly. In some cases, the very poor sold their own teeth while still alive to dentists who could transplant them into the mouths of wealthier patients with more money than those patients' own anatomy had provided. This transplantation practice had the additional bonus feature of occasionally transmitting syphilis from donor to recipient, which is the kind of consequence that gives medical innovations their mixed historical reputations. By the mid-Victorian era, porcelain teeth were becoming more common, which was a genuine improvement, not for aesthetic reasons, though porcelain was more convincing, but because human and animal teeth came with their own structural issues, including the tendency to decay in the mouth of the person wearing them as enthusiastically as they had decayed in the mouth of whoever had previously owned them. The dental chair, as a specific piece of furniture designed for dental work, did not become standard until the latter part of the century. Before that, extractions took place in whatever chair was available, with the patient held still by an assistant or by sheer terror, and the dentist standing over them with tools that bore a strong resemblance to the implements a farrier used on horses, which was not entirely coincidental. Sugar, meanwhile, was becoming more affordable and more widely consumed throughout the Victorian era. The result, across a population with no fluoride, no dental hygiene education, no accessible professional dental care, and an increasingly sweet diet, was predictable. Victorian skulls recovered by archaeologists show extensive decay, significant tooth loss, and a pattern of dental health that deteriorates markedly across the century as sugar consumption rises. The upper classes, able to afford both more sugar and more dentistry, sometimes ended up worse than the poor, who ate less sugar but also received fewer interventions, the net result of which was equally catastrophic in different ways. By the time of the First World War, the dental health of British military recruits was sufficiently alarming that it prompted official reports. The army began providing dental care. Schools began teaching children to brush their teeth. The connection between what you eat, what you clean, and whether you keep your teeth into old age slowly became public knowledge. It was, as these things often are, information that arrived somewhat after the damage was done. The Victorians had rules for everything. Not guidelines, not gentle suggestions, rules, codified and published in thick etiquette manuals that middle-class families consulted with the seriousness of legal documents. There were rules for how to enter a room, how to leave a room, how to stand in a room, and how long you were permitted to stand there before it became peculiar. There were rules governing the precise angle at which a calling card should be left on a silver tray, the number of days one was obligated to wait before returning a social call, and the specific shade of mourning black that was appropriate at various intervals after a death. Full black for the first year, then half mourning, which permitted muted purples and greys, before you were finally permitted to ease back into actual colours, like a person slowly reintegrating into society after something went wrong. There were separate rules for men, for women, for servants, for children, for guests, for hosts, and for people who had accidentally committed some minor social infraction and needed to navigate the fallout with minimal visible damage. The etiquette manual industry was substantial. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861, remains famous, but was by no means alone. Dozens of competing manuals addressed every possible social scenario with the thoroughness of legal commentaries, often contradicting one another on specific points, and thereby creating a secondary anxiety about which authority to follow when the authorities disagreed. The manuals addressed table settings, the correct order of service at dinner, how to introduce people of different social ranks to one another without accidentally suggesting an equivalence that did not exist, how to decline an invitation without causing offence, how to accept an invitation while communicating a mild lack of enthusiasm, and how to write a letter of condolence that was warm enough to be genuine without being so specific that it raised uncomfortable questions. The letter. There were rules for letters that occupied chapters. The address was formatted precisely. The salutation was calibrated to the relationship. The body of the letter maintained a register appropriate to both the subject and the correspondent. The closing was selected from a hierarchy that ranged from yours faithfully, used for those you did not know personally, down through yours sincerely, yours truly, yours affectionately, and yours ever, each carrying a distinct social weight that the recipient was expected to pass correctly. Sending too warm a closing to someone of higher rank was presumptuous. Sending too formal a closing to a friend was cold. Getting it wrong communicated something, even if the letter itself said nothing of consequence. Envelopes, yes, had rules. Sealing them carelessly suggested disrespect. Addressing them incorrectly, wrong title, omitted honorific, misspelled name, was a meaningful slight, whether intentional or not. A letter to a married woman from a social acquaintance was addressed to her husband's name. A letter to a widow preserved her husband's name. A letter to an unmarried woman was addressed to Miss, followed by her full name, not merely her first name, unless you were on sufficiently intimate terms for the first name to be appropriate, which the etiquette manuals would help you determine if you were uncertain. The function of all this, beneath its elaborate surface, was the function of a code, to separate those who knew it from those who did not, and to allow the former to identify the latter without saying so directly. Etiquette was, in its practical operation, a class-sorting mechanism delivered through the medium of which fork you picked up first. And if this sounds exhausting, you are correct. It was entirely exhausting. The Victorians knew it was exhausting. They did it anyway, every day, with straight backs and unrevealing expressions, because the alternative, a world in which anyone could walk into any room and be received on their own terms, was considerably more frightening than the rules. Victorian childhood for a significant portion of the population did not involve toys, schooling, or any extended period of play. It involved work. Very young children, sometimes as young as 5 or 6, were employed in coal mines, factories, and chimneys, not because the Victorians were universally monstrous, but because the economy ran on cheap, small labour, and no one had yet passed a law saying it shouldn't. In coal mines, children called trappers sat alone in complete darkness for shifts of up to 12 hours, operating ventilation doors by pulling a string. They didn't move. They couldn't see. They just sat and pulled the string when they heard a cart coming. Slightly older children worked as hurriers, bent double, dragging coal carts through tunnels too low for adults. Climbing boys, chimney sweeps, were sent up chimneys that were actively warm, sometimes lit, to dislodge soot with their bodies. The work caused spinal deformities, lung disease, and a specific cancer of the scrotum so common among chimney sweeps that it became known as chimney sweeps cancer. This was not considered a national emergency. It was considered Tuesday. The coal mine testimony collected by parliamentary commissioners in 1842, which eventually led to the Mines Act of that year, is some of the most striking historical documentation of the period. Children were asked about their working conditions and answered with the plainness of people describing something entirely unremarkable. A boy of 7 said he worked from 4 in the morning until 5 in the evening. A girl of 8 said she had been doing so since she was 5. They described the darkness, the cold water that collected in low tunnels, the rats, the weight of the cart harness worn across the chest and hips, and the punishment administered when a load arrived late. They described it all without complaint, because complaint required the concept that things might be otherwise, and they had been working in mines since before they had developed that concept. The commissioners were disturbed enough by what they found that they published illustrations alongside the testimony, drawings of children dragging carts on all fours through low passages, girls in harnesses pulling loads that outweighed them. The illustrations were distributed publicly and generated genuine outrage among the middle-class reading public, which is how public outrage generally worked in the Victorian era. It required the thing to be made visible to people who had chosen not to look directly at it. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited boys under 10 and all girls and women from working underground. This was understood at the time as a significant reform. Boys of 10 and above continued working underground. The surface work, sorting coal, operating machinery, maintaining equipment, remained available to younger children and was not covered by the Act. Factory reform followed a similar trajectory, gradual, contested, incomplete, each advance representing the minimum concession that reformers could extract from an economic system that regarded child labour as both necessary and natural. The 10 Hours Act of 1847 limited working hours for women and children in textile mills to 10 hours a day. Manufacturers argued this would destroy industry. Industry survived. Compulsory education, which arrived in stages from 1870 onward, was probably the single most effective intervention, not because it changed attitudes about child labour directly, but because it occupied children's time with school and made the casual use of very young children in full-time work practically difficult. By the end of the century, the 9-year-old trapper sitting alone in the dark with a string was becoming a historical image rather than a current fact. It had taken the better part of 60 years and required being shown the pictures before anyone in a position to act found it sufficiently unacceptable to act. Before the flush toilet arrived in Victorian homes, the solution to human waste management in cities was essentially to produce it, ignore it, and let it become someone else's problem downstream. London in the early Victorian era operated on the cesspit system. Pits dug beneath houses, theoretically emptied by night soil men, practically overflowing into neighbouring foundations, basements, and eventually the Thames. The river, which was also the city's primary water source, became so foul by the middle of the 19th century that Parliament itself had to suspend its sessions during what became known as the Great Stink of 1858, because the smell rising from the water directly outside the building was too aggressive for lawmakers to remain in the same building as it and still function. This was, eventually, the event that prompted the construction of London's sewage system. Before that, the city of 5 million people had been essentially living inside its own waste, and no one had found this quite alarming enough to act on. The Great Stink is one of those historical events that functions as a perfect parable about the gap between knowing something is a problem and finding it bad enough to fix. Londoners had known the Thames was polluted for decades. They had also known, since Dr. John Snow's meticulous epidemiological work during the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak, that contaminated water caused cholera, the disease that killed tens of thousands of Londoners periodically throughout the century. The public health reformer Edwin Chadwick had been writing reports about sanitary conditions and their relationship to disease since the 1840s. The information was not hidden, it was in reports. It was in newspapers. It was in the rising death toll of the poorer districts, which correlated directly with proximity to contaminated water sources. Parliament took action when the smell reached their windows. Not before. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed a sewage system for London, 83 miles of main sewers, over 1,000 miles of smaller street sewers, pumping stations to move waste downstream and away from the city's water intake points. Construction began in 1859 and took a decade. The system still functions today. Bazalgette has a plaque on the embankment. He deserves considerably more than a plaque. The flush toilet itself, the specific mechanism of a water cistern releasing into a bowl to carry waste away, was not invented by Thomas Crapper, despite the story. The mechanism was developed iteratively by several engineers across several decades, and Crapper, who was a real plumber, was a successful manufacturer and improver of the technology rather than its originator. This is a disappointment to many people who are looking forward to the etymological connection, and you can see why. What the flush toilet required, to function usefully rather than catastrophically, was a sewage system to connect to. Wealthy households that installed flush toilets before the sewage infrastructure existed sometimes connected them to their cesspits, which then filled faster and required more frequent emptying, or connected them to street drains not designed for the purpose, or connected them to nothing at all and created a new, localized problem of considerable enthusiasm. The combination of clean water supply and waste removal infrastructure that appeared gradually across Victorian Britain over the second half of the century was, statistically, the single most significant public health intervention of the era, more significant than any medical advance, more significant than any pharmaceutical development. Clean water and functional sewage reduced cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and infant mortality in ways that nothing else of the period came close to matching. The Victorians got there eventually. They just needed the smell to reach the people who could write the checks. Once Victorian doctors got their hands on electricity, which happened sometime in the mid-1800s, they became wildly optimistic about what it could cure. The answer, in their view, was almost everything. Electric belts were sold as treatments for impotence, back pain, rheumatism, kidney disease, and what was broadly described as weakness. You strapped a battery to your body, ran a current through it, and waited to feel improved. Electric baths existed, in which you sat in water through which a mild current was passed. Electric hairbrushes promised to stimulate the scalp and restore lost hair. Doctors administered electric shocks to paralyzed limbs with genuine therapeutic intent, which occasionally helped and occasionally made things significantly worse in ways that were not always immediately apparent. Electric corsets were sold to women with the promise that the current would tighten and tone the body beneath, which would be astonishing if true, and was, in fact, not true. The enthusiasm made a certain kind of sense, given the context. Electricity was new, invisible, powerful, and not yet fully understood by anyone. It made things move that hadn't moved. It produced light from nothing. It crossed distances instantaneously in ways that felt, to a generation encountering it for the first time, genuinely miraculous. If electricity could power a telegraph, illuminate a room, and drive a motor, it was not obviously unreasonable to suppose it might also fix a bad back. The logic was wrong, but the leap was understandable, and the Victorian medical establishment made it with both feet and considerable enthusiasm. The electric belt was perhaps the most commercially successful of the electrical health products. Manufactured by several competing companies and advertised extensively in newspapers and popular magazines, it consisted of a series of zinc and copper discs arranged in a belt worn against the skin, which generated a mild galvanic current when moistened by perspiration. The advertisements promised restoration of vitality, relief from nervous exhaustion, an improvement in a range of conditions that the copy described with a coyness that suggested the actual complaint was something the advertiser preferred not to name directly. The target market was men experiencing what the era called loss of manly vigor, which is a phrase that requires no further elaboration. Women were not excluded from the electric treatment market. Specialized devices were marketed for female conditions, uterine complaints, menstrual irregularities, the ever-useful hysteria, and some Victorian gynecologists administered electrical currents internally as a treatment for pelvic disorders, with results that the medical literature of the period describes in terms of patient improvement, and that later historians have assessed rather differently. The electric bath took the logic further. You sat in a shallow tub of water, electrodes were attached. A current was passed through the water at a strength calibrated by the attending physician, which meant calibrated by the attending physician's best guess. Proponents argued that the current stimulated circulation, relieved rheumatism, and produced a general sense of well-being. Skeptics pointed out that sitting in electrified water was something most people's instincts correctly identified as dangerous. Both sides had a point, depending on the voltage. Legitimate medical uses of electricity did exist, and were developed alongside the quackery. Galvanism, using electrical current to stimulate muscle contraction, had genuine applications in treating certain types of paralysis, and some of the work done in Victorian medical electricity contributed to later developments in physiotherapy and cardiac treatment. The problem was that the legitimate uses and the fraudulent ones coexisted in the same marketplace, described in the same language, sold by practitioners whose credentials were equally difficult to verify. The electric age promised that a force invisible and unstoppable could be harnessed for human flourishing. The Victorians, characteristically, believed it completely, bought the belt, sat in the bath, brushed their hair with the special brush, and waited for the improvement that was surely just a few more volts away. Victorians took death seriously, aggressively, elaborately, socially seriously. When a member of a household died, the expectations were immediate and comprehensive. Mirrors were covered so the soul couldn't become trapped in its own reflection. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death. Black crepe was hung on the front door to announce the household's loss to the neighbourhood, and black armbands, black stationery, and black-edged calling cards were deployed with the efficiency of a logistics operation. For women, the rules were particularly demanding. A widow was expected to wear full mourning, head-to-toe black, no jewellery except jet, no socialising, no entertainment, for a minimum of 2 years, then half mourning for another year. Then, theoretically, a gradual return to normal life, though some women stayed in black for decades, either out of genuine grief or because the alternative was negotiating an entirely new wardrobe. Men, as with most things, got off considerably lighter. 6 months of a black armband, and then business as usual. The asymmetry was not accidental. A widow was defined by her loss in a way that a widower simply was not, because a woman's social identity in the Victorian framework was organised around her relationship to a man. Without a husband, she occupied a category that required visible marking. The black dress was not merely grief, it was information, broadcast to everyone she encountered, about her status, her availability or unavailability, and the correct way to address her situation. A widower, retaining his profession, his income, his household, and his social standing, required no such marking. He grieved privately and got on with it, which was considered appropriately masculine. The funeral itself was an elaborate production scaled to the family's means and, critically, to the neighbourhood's expectations. A funeral that was insufficiently impressive was a statement, and not a good one. Undertakers offered packages. Black-plumed horses drew the hearse. Hired mourners, mutes they were called, stood at the door of the house in black and followed the cortege in silence, their presence purchased to add gravity to the proceedings regardless of how many genuine mourners were available. Professional mourners for hire sounds like a modern satirical invention. It was a real and established Victorian trade. The costs were significant enough that working-class families paid into funeral clubs throughout their lives, small weekly contributions that accumulated toward the guarantee of a decent burial, because a pauper's funeral, in which the parish buried you in an unmarked grave without ceremony, was considered among the worst fates that could befall a respectable family. People who could not afford adequate food for the week maintained their funeral club contributions. The burial mattered more than the living, or at least it mattered in a way that the living could not afford to neglect. Black-edged stationery was used for all correspondence during the mourning period. The width of the black border narrowed as the months passed, widest in the immediate aftermath, gradually thinning as the grief was understood to be receding, until eventually correspondence returned to plain white, which signalled to any observant recipient that the required period had elapsed, and the family was formally re-entering the social world. Queen Victoria, as in so many things, represented the extreme end of the spectrum. After Albert's death in 1861, she wore black until her own death in 1901. 40 years of unbroken mourning that the nation absorbed as normal. As though the natural state of the monarchy was perpetual widowhood, she was not criticizing the system when she did this. She was, in her own estimation, following it. The rules said grief was owed to the dead. Victoria simply paid without limit, and a country that had built an entire industry around visible mourning found it difficult to argue with her logic. If Victorian medicine had a defining characteristic, it was confidence. An extraordinary, unwavering confidence in remedies that would, in retrospect, prove to be considerably more dangerous than the problems they were solving. Cocaine was extracted from coca leaves in 1859 and immediately incorporated into a staggering variety of products: cough drops, throat lozenges, hay fever treatments, and, most famously, Vin Mariani, a cocaine-laced wine endorsed by Queen Victoria, Pope Leo XIII, Thomas Edison, and Ulysses S. Grant. Heroin, synthesized in 1898, was initially marketed by Bayer, the aspirin company, as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. It was sold over the counter for coughs. Morphine itself was widely prescribed for everything from period pain to general malaise, and laudanum, which combined opium and alcohol into one convenient bottle, was given to children. The Victorian pharmacist was, essentially, a very well-stocked dealer with a counter and excellent penmanship. The appeal of cocaine specifically was, from a Victorian medical standpoint, entirely logical. It worked. Applied to the throat, it numbed pain and suppressed coughing. Applied to the nose, it cleared congestion dramatically. Applied to the eye before surgery, this was a genuine and important discovery. It provided local anesthesia that allowed eye operations to be performed without the patient needing to be rendered fully unconscious. Carl Koller, the Viennese ophthalmologist who established this in 1884, was celebrated throughout the medical world. Sigmund Freud, working in the same hospital at the same time, was conducting his own enthusiastic research into cocaine's properties, and published a paper called Über Coca that described the drug in terms of such unreserved admiration that it reads, to a modern eye, less like a scientific paper and more like a very convincing advertisement. Freud recommended cocaine for morphine addiction, which introduced a second problem to patients who had been trying to resolve a first one. He recommended it for depression, for fatigue, for digestive disorders, and for what he called neurasthenia, a Victorian catch-all diagnosis for the general state of feeling overwhelmed by modern life, which was apparently as prevalent in 1884 as in any subsequent era. Vin Mariani deserves particular attention because its marketing was extraordinary, even by the standards of an era with no advertising regulations. The wine contained approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce, produced by steeping coca leaves in Bordeaux wine and allowing the alcohol to extract the active compounds. It was sold across Europe and America as a tonic wine, suitable for the elderly, for convalescents, for athletes, and for people who simply wished to feel more energetic. Pope Leo XIII appeared on a testimonial poster. He was not the only head of state to endorse it. The product won medals at international exhibitions. It was served at dinner parties. It was given to children who seemed listless. The transition from confidence to concern happened gradually, then quickly, as the pattern of dependence became impossible to ignore. Cocaine wards appeared in hospitals. The cheerful productivity that users reported in the first weeks gave way to anxiety, paranoia, and a physical craving that the earlier literature had somehow neglected to predict. Heroin, Bayer's non-addictive morphine substitute, produced its own wards within a decade of its release. By 1916, the Defence of the Realm Act in Britain restricted the sale of cocaine and opium. prompted partly by concerns about soldiers self-medicating. The over-the-counter era ended not with a reckoning, but with paperwork, the way most Victorian excesses eventually resolved, quietly, bureaucratically, with the underlying confidence that this time the new remedies would be better. They were, mostly, though the confidence remained essentially intact. Below the streets of Victorian London, in the tunnels and drains that ran beneath the city, lived and worked a group of people who occupied perhaps the lowest rung of the already extremely low Victorian economic ladder. The Toshers. These were individuals who waded through the sewers searching for valuables, coins, silverware, bones, and anything else that had been dropped, flushed, or otherwise lost to the underground current. They worked at low tide, sometimes spending entire days underground, navigating in near darkness by touch and smell, occasionally disturbed by giant rats, occasional collapses, and the hazard of being overtaken by a sudden flush of water from above that could drown a person in a tunnel with no exit. They worked illegally for most of the early Victorian era, since sewer access was restricted by the city authorities, which meant they were also criminals with excellent spatial awareness and very strong stomachs. Despite the conditions, Toshers could make a reasonable living. On a good day in a wealthy district, the pickings were surprisingly substantial. Henry Mayhew, the journalist whose London Labour and the London Poor documented the lives of the city's working poor with extraordinary detail, interviewed Toshers in the 1850s and recorded their accounts with a combination of fascination and what reads as barely contained amazement that these people existed and that no one above ground was paying much attention. The Toshers described their routes, the specific tunnels they preferred, the districts whose underground deposits were richest, the navigation techniques they used in the dark. They spoke of the work with a professional pride that Mayhew found somewhat startling given the circumstances. The sewers they worked in were, for most of the early Victorian period, the original brick tunnels built over centuries, low, cramped, irregular, flooded at high tide and running with a mixture of household waste, industrial runoff, and whatever the streets above had contributed through the drains. The smell was, by all accounts, considerable. Toshers wore long canvas aprons, carried lanterns, and used a long pole both for balance and for probing the sludge ahead of them for hidden drops or unexpected depths. They moved in small groups when they could, partly for safety, and partly because the tunnels were disorienting enough that a lone worker could become lost underground for hours. The Tosher was one figure in a broader ecosystem of people who made their living from the city's waste. Mudlarks worked the riverbanks at low tide, searching the Thames mud for coal, rope, bones, and copper nails that fell from the boats working the river. Children made up a significant proportion of the mudlarks, small, light enough to move quickly across soft mud, and willing to work for whatever they found. Bone grubbers collected animal bones from the streets, which were sold to bone merchants who processed them into fertilizer, glue, and a carbon compound used to refine sugar. Rag and bone men collected everything else. The economics of Victorian poverty had produced an entire shadow economy built on what the prosperous classes discarded, and this economy was large enough to support thousands of families. It was also entirely invisible to the prosperous classes, who threw things away and did not consider where away was or who was there to receive it. The construction of Bazalgette's new sewer system from 1859 onward changed the Toshers' world dramatically. The new tunnels were larger, more regular, and critically fitted with grates and access controls that made unauthorized entry considerably more difficult. The golden age of Toshering, such as it was, ended with the modernization of the very system that had made it possible. The waste went further downstream. The tunnels became less accessible, and the city above, cleaner and more orderly, continued not noticing. Victorian England had a genuine, documented, not entirely irrational fear of being buried alive. This was not a niche anxiety. It was widespread, frequently discussed in newspapers, and eventually addressed by a small but dedicated industry of inventors who produced what were called safety coffins, coffins fitted with bells, flags, or speaking tubes that connected to the surface, so that anyone unfortunate enough to wake up underground could signal for rescue. The fear had some basis in reality. Premature burial did occasionally occur, and the practice of opening old graves to make room for new ones in overcrowded city churchyards sometimes produced evidence, turned over coffin lids, scratch marks on the inside of the wood that suggested not everyone had been entirely as dead as advertised at the time of burial. The Victorians responded to this possibility with characteristic thoroughness. Waiting mortuaries were established where bodies were kept and monitored before burial. Doctors developed more rigorous methods of confirming death. And a subset of anxious Victorians simply requested in their wills that a vein be cut or a surgeon be present at the burial to confirm the situation beyond reasonable doubt. The medical profession's methods for confirming death in the early Victorian era were, by modern standards, alarmingly approximate. A mirror held to the mouth to detect breath, a feather placed near the nostrils, a candle flame. In more determined cases, a pin thrust beneath a fingernail, or the application of heat to the feet. The understanding of what constituted clinical death, the cessation of brain function versus the cessation of heartbeat, the distinction between coma and death, the specific signs that differentiated deep unconsciousness from the genuine article was simply not advanced enough to provide certainty in every case. Cholera, in particular, produced a form of collapse so complete and so rapid that it occasionally fooled attending physicians, which is how several cholera victims of the 1840s and 50s ended up in the historical record having reportedly sat up or knocked on the lid. The safety coffin inventors approached the problem with genuine ingenuity. A German patent from 1822 described a coffin equipped with a tube connecting the burial chamber to the surface, through which air could be pumped and through which sound could travel. A spring-loaded lid mechanism was triggered by movement inside. A flag on the surface would rise automatically. By the latter part of the century, several competing designs existed, each with its own system of signals, speaking tubes, bells, and emergency ventilation arrangements. The Count Karnicki, a Russian nobleman who held a Belgian patent on his design, promoted his invention at exhibitions across Europe with a demonstration that involved being buried in a box and triggering the mechanism himself, which took a particular kind of confidence in your own engineering. The waiting mortuary, established in several German and British cities, addressed the anxiety from the other end. Rather than providing an escape mechanism, it prevented premature burial in the first place by keeping bodies under observation, sometimes for days, until putrefaction, nature's own confirmation of death, made the situation unambiguous. Attendants monitored for any sign of movement. The system worked well as a public health measure and, one imagines, somewhat less well for the attendants who occupied the building around the clock with a collection of bodies in various states of advanced certainty. The fear gradually faded as medicine improved, as stethoscopes became standard and reliable, as the understanding of cataleptic states advanced, as clinical death became something that could be established with greater precision. The safety coffins became curiosities. The waiting mortuaries closed. The bells went unrung. Though if you ask anyone who has read too many Victorian newspapers, the faint anxiety never entirely went away. Victorian England did not just tolerate freak shows, it embraced them as legitimate entertainment for all classes, PT. Barnum, operating across the Atlantic but selling his formula globally, and his British equivalents drew enormous crowds to exhibits featuring people with unusual physical characteristics. Giants, people with dwarfism, conjoined twins, individuals with rare medical conditions, and performers billed under names designed to maximize shock. The audience was not exclusively lower class or uneducated. The middle class attended, the aristocracy attended, royalty attended. General Tom Thumb, Charles Stratton, a man with dwarfism whose career Barnum managed from childhood, was invited to perform at Buckingham Palace and met Queen Victoria 3 times. The medical establishment also attended, sometimes examining performers with or without their consent, publishing their findings in journals, and classifying the people on display as specimens as casually as if they were insects pinned to a board. It was considered science. It was considered entertainment. It was considered normal. The language used to describe freak show performers, freaks, curiosities, monsters, wonders, was not considered cruel in the Victorian context. because the Victorian framework for understanding human difference did not include the concept of dignity as applied uniformly across all physical presentations. People with unusual bodies existed at the intersection of two Victorian obsessions: the scientific drive to classify and understand natural variation, and the entertainment industry's discovery that human difference was commercially inexhaustible. The freak show satisfied both interests simultaneously, which is perhaps why it attracted both ticket-buying crowds and note-taking physicians without either group finding the other's presence incongruous. The performers themselves occupied a complicated position. For many, exhibition was the best economic option available in a society that offered no accommodations, no disability provisions, and no alternative employment for bodies that did not fit standard labour requirements. Barnum's performers were paid, some of them very well by contemporary standards. Charles Stratton, performing as General Tom Thumb from the age of 4, accumulated enough wealth to own a yacht and a mansion in Connecticut, which is a better material outcome than most non-exhibited Victorians achieved. Joseph Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, was treated at the London Hospital in the 1880s and received visitors including members of the royal family. His circumstances were considerably better than they had been when he was touring with a showman under conditions he later described as intolerable. What complicated the performer's position was consent, specifically the degree to which it had been obtained and the degree to which it was meaningful. Children were exhibited by parents or managers who made decisions on their behalf. Adults who negotiated their own contracts did so in a marketplace where their alternatives were genuinely limited, which is a context that complicates the voluntariness of the arrangement. The medical examinations were sometimes sought by performers who hoped for treatment and sometimes imposed on performers who were the subjects of research papers they would never read, in which their bodies were described in clinical language that owed them nothing. The freak show began its slow decline in the late Victorian and Edwardian periods as changing attitudes toward disability, driven partly by the numbers of disabled men returning from wars, made public exhibition increasingly uncomfortable. The performers didn't disappear, they migrated into circus sideshows, vaudeville, and eventually film. The audiences didn't disappear either. They redirected their appetite for human difference into other channels that the subsequent century provided with reliable generosity. The Victorian freak show was not an aberration, it was a mirror. What it reflected about the era that created and consumed it is worth sitting with for longer than the length of a ticket stub. The Victorians' affair with arsenic did not stay confined to the walls. It moved enthusiastically into the wardrobe. The same brilliant emerald green that dyed wallpaper was also used to dye fabric, and that fabric was made into ball gowns, opera gloves, hair decorations, and artificial flowers. Women who wore these garments absorbed arsenic through their skin over the course of an evening. Dressmakers and milliners who worked with the fabric daily were exposed far more intensively. Accounts from the 1860s describe factory workers producing artificial arsenic-dyed flowers who lost their hair, developed skin ulcers, and suffered damage to their eyes and noses from prolonged exposure to the dye dust. When a doctor named Alfred Swain Taylor began publicizing the connection between the green dye and these symptoms, the reaction from the fashion industry was essentially defensive. The color was too popular to abandon immediately. Production continued. Women continued to wear it. The dressmakers continued to get sick. And for several more years the most fashionable colour in England remained, technically, a slow poison. The artificial flower industry was the epicentre of the damage. By the 1860s, London alone had thousands of women employed in the manufacture of artificial flowers, decorative sprays worn in hair, pinned to bodices, arranged in hats, and a substantial proportion of those flowers were dyed with arsenical green. The workers sat at tables covered in the dye powder, handling stems and petals for hours at a stretch, breathing the dust and absorbing it through their fingers. The symptoms appeared gradually. First irritation of the hands, then sores that wouldn't heal, then the characteristic deterioration of the cartilage of the nose as the arsenic destroyed the tissue directly. A young flower maker named Matilda Schurer died in 1861 of arsenic poisoning attributable to her work. Her case was documented and publicized. and it generated genuine public discussion, letters to newspapers, questions in Parliament, a flurry of concern that produced several news cycles and then subsided, as news cycles do, without producing immediate regulatory change. The flower factories continued operating. The green continued selling. The wearer of the gown was in a considerably better position than the maker. A woman wearing an arsenic green ball gown for an evening absorbed a fraction of the dose that the worker who made it had accumulated over months. But the dose was not zero, and the practice of wearing arsenical fabric against the skin for hours, particularly in rooms warmed by bodies and gas lighting where the rate of absorption increased, was not without effect. Skin irritation, rashes, and what Victorian physicians noted as a puzzling susceptibility to illness among fashionable women in certain social seasons was not always connected to the dresses, but some physicians made the connection and said so in print. The fashion for green fabric declined more quickly than the fashion for green wallpaper, partly because the worker deaths were more visible and more directly attributable, and partly because synthetic aniline dyes were beginning to offer a range of colours that could replicate the vibrancy of Scheele's green without the lethal component. By the 1880s, synthetic dyes had largely displaced the arsenical compounds in fabric production. The green did not disappear. It simply became achievable by other, less fatal means. What lingered was the lesson, which the Victorian fashion industry absorbed partially and selectively, that the process of making beautiful things could be invisible in its cost to the people making them, and that as long as the cost remained invisible, there was limited commercial incentive to change it. Before the telephone, before email, before any of the technologies that allow you to casually reach out to someone without ceremony, the Victorians had the calling card system, an elaborate social protocol that required you to carry small engraved cards bearing your name and, if applicable, your title, and leave them at the homes of people you wished to visit or acknowledge. This sounds simple. It was not simple. There was a precise vocabulary encoded in how you left the card. Folding the upper right corner meant you had delivered the card in person rather than sending a servant. Folding the lower left corner indicated you were leaving the area. Leaving a card without asking to come inside meant you were making a social courtesy visit but not requesting a meeting. Leaving 2 cards, one for the lady of the house, one for the gentleman, was standard. Leaving the wrong number was a social error. Failing to return a card within a reasonable window was an unmistakable insult. And if someone left you a card and you did not wish to reciprocate the social connection, you had to navigate the delicate art of not returning it, without it being obvious that you had chosen not to return it, which everyone would know immediately and discuss at length. The card itself was a physical object of careful specification. The standard size was approximately 3.5 inches by 2 inches, small enough to fit in a card case, large enough to be legible without squinting. The typeface was engraved, not printed, because printing was detectable to a discerning eye and suggested economy rather than quality. The weight of the card, the whiteness of the stock, the crispness of the engraving, all communicated the financial and social standing of the bearer before a single word was read. A card printed on flimsy stock in an undistinguished typeface said something. What it said was not flattering. The silver card tray on which incoming cards were placed was itself a statement, its presence in the hallway indicating a household that received calls and managed them correctly. The cards accumulated during a social season were kept, sorted, and occasionally reviewed, providing a physical record of one's social connections that could be consulted when compiling invitation lists, assessing who owed whom a return call, and establishing the precise state of any given relationship in the network. Morning calls, which took place in the early afternoon, because Victorian mornings extended to approximately 2 o'clock by social convention, were the standard occasion for card use. You arrived, the servant took your card to the mistress of the house, and the mistress decided whether to be at home. Being at home was a decision, not a physical state. A woman who was at home received you. A woman who was not at home was in the house, but had decided not to receive callers on that particular occasion, and the card you left with the servant was the acknowledgement of your attempt. Both parties understood the fiction completely. Neither party acknowledged it directly. If received, you stayed for between 15 and 30 minutes. Fewer than 15 was an insult. More than 30 was an imposition. You discussed acceptable topics, the weather, recent events of a non-controversial nature, mutual acquaintances, current entertainments, and you did not sit in the most comfortable chair, which was reserved for the hostess. You did not remove your coat or gloves unless invited to, which signaled the visit would be extended. You did not introduce controversial subjects. You did not outstay your welcome, and you were expected to know when your welcome was ending without being told directly, because being told directly was precisely the kind of thing that Victorian social convention existed to prevent. When you left another card, and the whole mechanism turned over and waited for the response. Victorian homes were, by modern standards, remarkably hostile environments, and some of the most serious threats came not from the obvious hazards but from the air itself. Gas lighting, which replaced candles in wealthier homes from the 1830s onward, burned coal gas that produced carbon monoxide as a byproduct. Rooms that were not adequately ventilated, and Victorian rooms, with their heavy curtains, sealed windows, and passionate commitment to keeping drafts out, were frequently not adequately ventilated. Accumulated dangerous concentrations of the gas slowly enough that occupants became drowsy and unwell, without connecting their symptoms to the air. Coal fires produced additional smoke and carbon monoxide. The arsenic in wallpaper off-gassed. The lead in paint off-gassed. The mercury in mirror backing off-gassed. A well-appointed Victorian drawing room was essentially a chamber of accumulated atmospheric hazards dressed in velvet, and the fashionable Victorian habit of spending long evenings in precisely these rooms, windows firmly closed, was the kind of thing that made the life expectancy statistics make a great deal of sense. The Victorian attitude toward fresh air was, to put it gently, complicated. On one hand, bad air, miasma, was understood to cause disease. The miasma theory, which attributed illness to foul-smelling air rising from decomposing matter, was the dominant medical explanation for epidemic disease through most of the century. Cholera, typhoid, malaria, all were attributed to miasma. This theory was wrong about the mechanism, but accidentally right about the remedy in certain contexts. Cleaning up the sources of bad smells often meant cleaning up the sources of actual bacterial contamination, and the resulting improvement in public health appeared to validate the theory even as germ theory was quietly dismantling it. On the other hand, the drafts that ventilated a room were considered dangerous. Cold air was associated with chills, chills with illness, and illness with death, which was not an unreasonable chain of association in a century before antibiotics. The solution most Victorian households arrived at was to seal the house against cold drafts, while maintaining a fire which created a warm enclosed environment in which whatever the house was producing, gas fumes, arsenic vapour, the byproducts of gas lighting, circulated freely among the inhabitants without meaningful dilution. Coal gas deserves particular attention because its hazards were intermittent and unpredictable in ways that made the connection to specific symptoms difficult to establish. A properly maintained gas lamp in a well-ventilated room was reasonably safe. A leaking fitting, a partly extinguished burner, a poorly maintained system in a sealed room, any of these could produce carbon monoxide concentrations sufficient to cause headaches, fatigue, and disorientation over a long evening, or unconsciousness, and death over a night. The Victorian morning habit of waking with a headache and attributing it to having slept poorly or to the weather was not always incorrect, but it was sometimes entirely explicable by the gas lamp that had burned low in the sealed bedroom overnight. The physician John Shaw Billings, writing in the 1880s, calculated the air requirements per person for a healthy indoor environment and compared them to the actual air volumes available in typical Victorian rooms given their ventilation practices. His conclusions were not encouraging. The rooms were too small, too sealed, and too full of people who were all exhaling carbon dioxide into air that was not being refreshed. The physical symptoms of mild oxygen deprivation, fatigue, inability to concentrate, low-grade headache, mapped almost perfectly onto the constellation of vague complaints that Victorian physicians spent their careers treating with tonics, rest, and optimism. Open a window, in other words. The Victorians almost never did. In the Victorian medical framework, women were fundamentally fragile, not in a way that earned them gentleness, but in a way that earned them a diagnosis. Hysteria was a catch-all condition applied to women who were anxious, sad, angry, sexually frustrated, intellectually ambitious, or simply inconvenient to the men around them. The symptoms were essentially anything a Victorian doctor found uncomfortable about female behaviour: fainting, crying, laughing inappropriately, arguing, refusing to eat, eating too much, expressing opinions, or failing to perform domestic duties with adequate enthusiasm. Treatment varied. Some doctors prescribed rest, weeks or months of forced inactivity, no reading, no socializing, no mental stimulation of any kind, delivered as a cure for women who were already going quietly mad from having nothing to do. Others prescribed marriage. Others prescribed the opposite of rest: vigorous exercise, cold water immersion, or admission to an asylum. The asylum population was disproportionately female. The diagnosis that sent women there required only the signature of a husband or male relative. The rest cure, developed by the American physician Silas Weir Mitchell and widely adopted in Britain, was perhaps the most systematically counterproductive of the available treatments. Mitchell prescribed 6 to 8 weeks of complete bed rest, no books, no writing, no intellectual activity, no visitors, except the physician and the assigned nurse, and a diet of milk and increasingly solid food designed to restore physical weight. His patients were women who came to him exhausted, unhappy, and frequently suffering from genuine depression or anxiety disorders for which the 19th century had no adequate conceptual framework. He put them to bed in empty rooms and told them to stop thinking. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the American writer, underwent the Mitchell rest cure in 1887 and came close to, as she later wrote, complete mental breakdown from it. She wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, about a woman confined to a room by her physician husband, slowly losing her mind within it, directly in response to her experience. She sent a copy to Mitchell. He did not change his methods. The asylum was a more drastic intervention, and its population told a story that Victorian society preferred to read as medical. Women were committed for a range of behaviours that included attempted suicide, refusal to eat, excessive religious devotion, and what committal papers sometimes described as moral insanity, a category that encompassed sexual behaviour outside marriage, expressions of strong political opinions, and the general problem of being a woman whose behaviour did not align with what the men responsible for her expected. A husband could have a wife committed, a father could have a daughter committed. The woman's own account of her mental state was, in most institutional frameworks, treated as evidence of the condition rather than testimony about it. This is not to say that Victorian asylums contained no one who was genuinely mentally ill or genuinely in need of care. They did. The institutions also contained women who were depressed, traumatized, economically dependent, socially confined, and expressing that confinement in ways that the period classified as illness rather than response. The difficulty, for historians and for the women themselves, is that the two populations occupied the same wards under the same diagnoses, and the records do not always permit the distinction. The word hysteria comes from the Greek for uterus, reflecting the ancient belief that the condition originated in the womb. Victorian medicine refined the ancient theory without fundamentally revising its central premise, that being a woman was, itself, a form of constitutional vulnerability that required management. It was a diagnosis built into the structure of a system that simultaneously created the conditions for distress and classified the distress as pathology. Some women found their way out, most simply endured. A Victorian dinner party was not a casual gathering. It was a performance, governed by rules of such precise complexity that etiquette manuals dedicated substantial chapters to it, and middle-class hostesses studied those chapters like exam material. Guests were ranked and seated according to social hierarchy, and arriving out of order, sitting in the wrong place, or being seen to eat the wrong food with the wrong implement in the wrong sequence was a social failure that could be discussed for weeks. There was a correct fork for fish and a different correct fork for meat, and using one when you should have used the other was the kind of error that got you quietly crossed off invitation lists. Conversation was governed too. Certain topics were forbidden at the table, including money, religion, politics, and anything that could be construed as disagreeable. The goal was not to communicate, but to perform civilization convincingly for a period of several hours, after which everyone could go home and say what they actually thought. The invitation itself was the first performance. A properly written dinner invitation specified the date, the hour, and occasionally the dress expectation, and was written on good paper in a clear hand, and delivered with sufficient notice to allow the recipient to accept or decline in writing, also on good paper, also in a clear hand, within a day or two of receipt. Accepting and then failing to appear was a significant social transgression. Declining and then appearing somewhere else that evening, where the hosts might hear of it, was worse. The Victorians maintained a vast internal ledger of social obligations and infractions that modern life, with its casual cancellations and last-minute texts, would find utterly exhausting, and the Victorians found simply normal. The seating arrangement was the hostess's most demanding task. Guests were ranked by title, then by social standing, then by the internal hierarchies of the local community, and seated accordingly, the most senior gentleman escorting the hostess into the dining room, the second most senior escorting the second most senior lady, and so on down the table in an order that communicated to every person present exactly where they stood relative to everyone else. Getting the order wrong offended the person who had been ranked lower than they believed themselves to deserve. Getting it right required the hostess to have a precise and current understanding of the social standing of every person invited, including any recent changes in fortune, title, or reputation that might have altered the calculation since the last time she had assembled this particular combination of guests. The table itself was architectural. A formal Victorian dinner table featured more implements per place setting than most modern kitchens contain in total. Multiple forks arranged in order of use from the outside in, multiple knives, multiple spoons, specific glasses for specific wines, a finger bowl, a bread plate, and in ambitious households a selection of specialized implements for specific foods. Fish knives, oyster forks, asparagus tongs, marrow scoops. The rule was to work from the outside inward through the courses, but knowing which outside implement corresponded to which course required either experience or careful observation of what the person next to you was doing, which was itself considered slightly gauche if done too obviously. Conversation moved in a specific pattern. You spoke to the person on your left for the first part of the meal, then turned to the person on your right for the second part, a rotation managed by the hostess, who signalled the turn. Speaking across the table was acceptable in moderation. Speaking over someone was not. Raising your voice was not. Discussing your own health in detail was considered tedious. Discussing the health of others in detail was considered gossip, which was both forbidden at the table and the primary activity of every gathering. The distinction between acceptable social observation and forbidden gossip was one of tone and direction rather than content, and navigating it successfully was one of the core competencies of Victorian social life. After dinner, the women withdrew to the drawing room while the men remained at the table with port and cigars, a separation so standard it required no explanation and received none. The women's drawing room conversation was understood to be lighter, the men's table conversation more substantive, though observers who recorded both reported that the actual content was roughly equivalent in frivolity, the men simply having the advantage of port. Victorian London's East End was home to a collection of establishments that sold prepared opium to be smoked, places that became known, through a combination of genuine reporting and spectacular journalistic embellishment, as opium dens. These rooms were real, they were legal, and they catered to a broader clientele than the lurid accounts suggested. Writers, intellectuals, and the occasional curious middle-class visitor came alongside the dock workers and the desperately addicted, drawn by a mixture of genuine appetite and the frisson of slumming. The Victorian practice of visiting poor areas for the experience of contrast, Charles Dickens wrote about them. Oscar Wilde put one in a novel, Journalists wrote breathless accounts of the horrors within, which drove more curious readers to find out for themselves. The opium trade, meanwhile, was not some underground operation. Britain had literally fought 2 wars with China in the previous decades to protect its right to sell opium into the Chinese market. The Victorian relationship with opiates was, in short, morally complicated in ways that the era preferred not to examine too closely. The Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856 are worth pausing on because they represent one of the more striking instances of Victorian moral compartmentalization. The East India Company, and later the British government directly, oversaw the production of opium in Bengal and its export to China, despite explicit Chinese attempts to prohibit the trade. When Chinese authorities seized and destroyed British opium stocks in 1839, Britain went to war to restore the trade. The official justification was free trade and the rights of British merchants. The product being traded was a narcotic that the Chinese government had prohibited, specifically because of the addiction and social damage it was causing to its population. Britain won both wars. The trade continued. At home, meanwhile, opium was legal, available, and widely used. The domestic opium den existed at the intersection of genuine addiction, immigrant community life. Many of the establishments in Limehouse were run by Chinese sailors and merchants who had settled in the East End, and the middle-class Victorian appetite for exotic experience in a safe enough frame to be retrieved from. Journalists went to opium dens and wrote about it. Their articles were vivid, sometimes accurate, and consistently framed around the contrast between the visiting narrator and the degraded regulars, a narrative structure that placed the reader securely on the side of the observers rather than the observed. The reality of the establishments was considerably less dramatic than the accounts suggested. Most were rooms in private houses or above shops, furnished with low platforms on which customers reclined, equipped with the pipes and prepared opium required for the purpose, and operated as small businesses by proprietors who charged for the product and the space. They were not, by the standards of Victorian entertainment options, particularly sensational. The theatre of the opium den existed largely in the prose of the people who wrote about it for readers who had not been. What the opium den represented, culturally, was a visible concentration of a habit that was otherwise distributed invisibly through the population, in the laudanum bottles in medicine cabinets, in the soothing syrups for children, in the prescriptions for nervous ladies in respectable households. The East End opium smoker was visible, foreign, and poor. The respectable Victorian opium consumer was private, domestic, and purchasing from a pharmacy. The distinction the era drew between them was not chemical. Thomas de Quincey had said as much in 1821, describing his own laudanum consumption in terms that made the parallel unavoidable. The Victorian reading public found his account fascinating, somewhat scandalous, and largely irrelevant to their own medicine cabinets. It was easier to locate the opium problem in Limehouse than in the parlour, and the Victorian talent for that particular kind of relocation was considerable. If there is one thing that sanitised period dramas consistently fail to convey about Victorian England, it is the smell, not the polite background smell of a slightly musty house. The industrial, biological, deeply committed smell of a city of several million people, most of whom did not have access to regular bathing, adequate sanitation, or any mechanism for removing the byproducts of daily life from the immediate vicinity of where they were produced. Streets were shared with horses, tens of thousands of working horses in London alone, whose contributions to the street surface were constant, substantial, and not always promptly removed. Slaughterhouses operated in residential areas. Tanneries, which processed animal hides using urine and dung, operated near rivers. Factories burned coal continuously. The Thames served simultaneously as water source, sewage outlet, and industrial dumping ground. And in summer, when the temperature rose and the river sank, the combination of all these elements produced an atmospheric experience that visitors from rural areas reportedly found physically disorienting on first encounter. The horse problem was enormous in ways that are now difficult to appreciate. because the horse has been removed from urban life so completely that we no longer think of it as an infrastructure problem. London in 1890 had approximately 50,000 working horses, pulling cabs, omnibuses, delivery wagons, private carriages, brewery drays, postal vans, and every other vehicle that moved through the city. Each horse produced between 15 and 35 pounds of manure per day, which accumulated on road surfaces and was managed by a workforce of crossing sweepers, often children, who cleared paths through it for pedestrians in exchange for tips. On dry days, the manure dried and became dust, which circulated through the air and settled on every surface, including food being sold from street stalls. On wet days, it became a liquid compound of mud and organic matter that soaked through shoes and adhered to the hems of long skirts with reliable efficiency. The crossing sweeper was one of the city's most visible poor workers, stationed at busy intersections, broom in hand, dependent entirely on the generosity of passers-by for income. Henry Mayhew recorded their testimony in the 1850s. Children who had been sweeping the same crossing since they were old enough to hold a broom, whose entire economic world was an area of perhaps 30 feet of roadway that they kept clear in exchange for coins from people who barely looked at them. Their earnings varied wildly with the weather, the foot traffic, and the moods of the prosperous. A good day near a fashionable shopping street might yield enough for a meal and a night's lodging. A bad day in the rain yielded nothing. The slaughterhouse situation was a separate atmospheric layer. Victorian London's abattoirs were not industrial facilities located at a sanitary distance from the population. They were neighbourhood businesses, tucked between houses and shops in working-class districts, conducting their operations in conditions that meant the surrounding streets experienced the sounds, smells, and frequently the physical evidence of the process at close range. The removal of live animals through city streets to reach these facilities added to the general sensory texture of the urban experience. Personal hygiene, in the absence of running hot water in most households, required effort and planning significant enough that it was simply not performed with the frequency that modern sensibilities consider standard. A full bath involved heating water over a fire, filling a portable tub, and then disposing of the water afterward, a process that might be undertaken weekly at best, less frequently in winter, and sometimes not at all during periods of illness or extreme poverty. The cumulative effect of all of this was an urban atmosphere that was simply, constantly, and comprehensively present to the senses in a way that modern cities, with their sealed buildings, filtered air, and chemical street cleaning, are not. Victorian Londoners were not oblivious to it. They complained about it constantly. They simply had no immediate remedy, and so they lived inside it, day after day, the way you eventually stop noticing a sound that never stops. The Victorian patent medicine industry operated on a philosophy of radical optimism. If you had a bottle, a label, and a sufficiently confident name, you could sell almost anything to almost anyone for almost any complaint, because neither consumer protection laws nor pharmaceutical regulation existed to complicate the transaction. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething children contained morphine and alcohol. Cocaine toothache drops, marketed specifically to children, contained cocaine. Dr. James's powder, sold for fevers, contained antimony, which is a heavy metal with a narrow margin between therapeutic and lethal dose. Radium water was sold in the 1900s as a health tonic, the logic being that radium was energetic and expensive, and therefore probably good for you. Godfrey's cordial, another popular children's medicine, contained enough opium to produce genuine dependence. These products were advertised in newspapers, endorsed by testimonials, and sold in respectable pharmacies alongside legitimate medications, with no requirement that anyone disclose what was actually in them. The testimonial was the cornerstone of patent medicine marketing, and it worked with a reliability that suggests the Victorians were either more trusting or more desperate than subsequent generations. Advertisements featured letters from grateful customers, clergymen, widows, retired military officers, describing in warm and specific detail how a particular preparation had cured them of precisely the complaint the reader currently experienced. The letters were sometimes genuine, sometimes invented, sometimes genuine in the sense that the writer believed what they were saying, without that belief having any relationship to pharmacological reality. A product that contained alcohol and opium would produce, in almost any user, a period of feeling considerably better, which was readily interpretable as evidence of a cure, particularly if the underlying complaint was pain, anxiety, or fatigue. The naming conventions of patent medicines were a genre unto themselves. Preparations incorporated words like soothing, strengthening, invigorating, nerve, vital, and specific medical terms applied with confident imprecision to suggest scientific backing without requiring any. Doctor appeared in many names, the doctor in question being either real and unconnected to the product, fictional, or the proprietor himself, who had given himself the title for marketing purposes without the inconvenience of medical training. The word patent, which appeared in patent medicine, was itself misleading. Most patent medicines were not patented, because patenting required disclosing the formula, which proprietors were extremely reluctant to do. The secrecy of the formula was both a commercial strategy and a practical necessity, since a disclosed formula was a formula that a competitor could replicate and that a chemist could analyze for content. Radium products arrived in the very late Victorian and Edwardian period, riding the wave of excitement that followed Marie Curie's discoveries. Radium water, water into which radium-containing rock had been placed to leach radioactive content, was sold in ceramic crocks, metal flasks, and elaborate home dispensers. The advertising copy described the healthful effects of gentle radioactivity on the human system with the same unearned confidence that had characterized every previous wave of Victorian medical enthusiasm. Eben Byers, an American socialite who consumed Radithor, a commercial radium water product, for several years, lost most of his jaw to radiation necrosis before his death in 1932. His case generated a headline that became famous: "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off." It was, as epitaphs for an era of unregulated medicine go, remarkably concise. The regulatory response came gradually. The British Pharmacy Act of 1868, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, and eventually the more comprehensive controls of the 20th century all chipped away at the free market in dangerous compounds. Each legislative step was contested by industry, described as an overreach, and predicted to destroy commercial enterprise. Commercial enterprise survived every intervention. The jaw losses decreased. In a wealthy Victorian household, the domestic staff operated according to a hierarchy so rigid and so thoroughly governed by unwritten rules that entering service required an almost ethnographic education in the customs of a particular household before you could function. Within it, without giving offence to someone above or below you. Servants did not speak to family members unless spoken to. They did not use the main staircase. And, quote, they did not make eye contact with guests. If a family member unexpectedly encountered a servant in a hallway, the servant was expected to turn and face the wall until the family member had passed, in order to preserve the comfortable fiction that the house ran itself. Upper servants, the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, had their own hierarchy and their own dining arrangements, ate separately from the lower servants, and were addressed by title rather than first name. The scullery maid, at the bottom of the domestic pyramid, began work before the household woke and ended it after everyone else had gone to bed, and existed, in many houses, in a state of near invisibility that was not incidental but deliberate. Domestic service was the largest single employment category for women in Victorian England. At the peak of the Victorian era, approximately 1 in 3 women between the ages of 15 and 25 was employed in domestic service as maids of various gradations, cooks, laundresses, nursemaids, and ladies' maids. The work was not glamorous. It was relentless. A scullery maid in a large household rose at 5:30 in the morning to clean the kitchen range, black it with stove polish, light it, and begin the first round of a day that included washing every pot, pan, and dish used by a kitchen that produced 3 or more meals daily for a household of 10 to 30 people. She worked until 10 or 11 at night. She received 1 half-day off per week, occasionally 2. Her wages were approximately £8 to £12 per year, from which her uniform, usually provided by the family, was sometimes partially deducted. The hierarchy below stairs was as carefully maintained as the hierarchy above it. The butler oversaw the male servants and the wine cellar, and represented the household to tradespeople in the outside world. The housekeeper oversaw the female servants and the household's domestic supplies and keys, carrying the latter on a ring at her waist that functioned as a physical symbol of authority. These 2 figures dined together, and apart from the rest of the staff, a table arrangement that communicated their position as precisely as the family's own seating order communicated theirs. Junior servants were addressed by first name. Senior servants were addressed by title. A footman named James, who worked for the family, might be renamed John by his employer if there was already a footman called James, because maintaining a consistent name for a footman was considered a reasonable household convenience that outweighed the footman's prior claim to his own name. The rules governing behaviour were extensive and largely unwritten, transmitted through observation, correction, and the swift consequences of error. A parlour-maid who answered the door incorrectly, arranged flowers in a vase the family disliked, or was seen in a part of the house she was not supposed to occupy, could be dismissed without notice, without the character reference that was essential for obtaining another position. Employment without a character was effectively unemployment, because no respectable household would hire a servant who could not produce written confirmation from a previous employer of their honesty, sobriety, and compliance. The Victorian servant was, by the end of the century, becoming a figure of cultural tension. As working-class women gained access to factory work that paid comparable wages with defined hours and Sundays off, the supply of women willing to enter domestic service began to decline. Household management guides from the 1890s begin to reflect, with increasing frequency, the anxious question of where the servants were all going. They were going where conditions were better. The Victorian household noticed their absence considerably more than it had ever noticed their presence. Victorians loved nature. They also loved killing nature, preserving it, dressing it in tiny clothes, and displaying it in glass cases in their drawing rooms. The taxidermy industry in Victorian England was substantial and varied, but its most extraordinary product was anthropomorphic taxidermy, the practice of arranging preserved animals in human poses and domestic scenes. Frogs dressed in formal wear playing billiards, kittens attending a schoolroom, complete with tiny desks and a blackboard, squirrels engaged in a tea party. These pieces were commissioned, purchased, displayed in homes, and exhibited at major exhibitions to considerable public admiration. The most celebrated practitioner was a man named Walter Potter, who spent years constructing scenes of preserved animals in human social situations with a level of obsessive detail that suggests he had given the matter more thought than almost anything else in his life. The Victorian public found this delightful. There were no concerns about the aesthetic of it. It appeared in respectable home decor guides. The frogs played on. The broader taxidermy industry operated at several levels simultaneously. At the scientific end, natural history museums were assembling collections of preserved specimens that represented the Victorian ambition to catalogue and contain the natural world, to have, in one building, examples of everything that lived, organised by class and genus, and displayed under glass for the edification of the visiting public. The Natural History Museum in London, opened in 1881, was the grandest expression of this impulse, but it existed on a continuum that ran from the national institution down through provincial museums, gentlemen's private collections, and the glass cases of suburban drawing rooms where a stuffed fox or a mounted salmon from a good fishing trip occupied the wall with the confidence of a genuine trophy. At the decorative end, taxidermy was interior design. Fashionable Victorian homes displayed stuffed animals, as other periods displayed vases or paintings. A glass dome containing a colourful exotic bird was a standard parlour ornament. Stags' heads mounted on oak shields occupied hallways. Cases containing reconstructed habitats, a weasel in an artificial bank, an owl in an artificial hollow tree, were considered both educational and attractive. The craft had genuine technical standards. A well-mounted specimen was expected to look alive, natural, and characteristic of the species, which required skill, anatomical knowledge, and the patience to work with materials that were, by definition, in an advanced state of not cooperating. Walter Potter's work operated at a particular extreme of the anthropomorphic tradition that deserves specific attention. His most famous piece, The Death and Burial of Cock Robin, involved 98 British birds arranged in a funeral scene derived from the nursery rhyme, a sparrow with a bow and arrow, a beetle with a thread and needle, a fly with a looking-glass, each figure posed with a specificity that represented years of construction. He built it over several years, beginning in 1861, and exhibited it to a public that found it charming. He went on to construct a kitten wedding, a rabbit school, a squirrel's gin shop complete with miniature bottles, and dozens of other arrangements, each one requiring the acquisition and preservation of the relevant animals and the construction of the appropriate miniature props. The Victorians' comfort with death as a decorative material is perhaps the clearest lens through which to understand the taxidermy fashion. They lived with death more immediately than subsequent generations. Higher child mortality, shorter life expectancy, the physical realities of household animals and food production, and had developed an aesthetic relationship with mortality that permitted it to be present in the drawing room without making the drawing room feel like a place where something had gone wrong. The preserved bird under the glass dome was not morbid. It was a specimen. It was nature, organized and contained and made decorative, which was exactly what Victorian culture wanted from the natural world. The fashion declined with the Edwardian era, as taste shifted, as natural history moved firmly into institutions rather than private homes, and as the specific combination of scientific enthusiasm and decorative ambition that had made stuffed animals in tiny suits seem like a reasonable idea quietly lost its cultural grip. The frogs, however, remain. Several of Potter's pieces survived. They are in museums now. People visit them. No one is quite sure how to describe their feelings afterward. The Victorian discovery of the seaside as a leisure destination coincided, unfortunately, with the Victorian conviction that direct sunlight was a social liability. Pale skin signified wealth, that you did not have to work outdoors, while tan skin suggested agricultural labour, low social status, and a general lack of ambition. Going to the seaside was fashionable. Being seen to have gone to the seaside in any detectably solar way was not. Victorian beachgoers addressed this tension through the bathing machine, a wooden hut on wheels, dragged by a horse into the surf, from which the bather could descend a set of steps directly into the water without ever being visible on the beach. Men and women bathed in strictly separated sections. Women's bathing costumes covered them from neck to knee, made of heavy wool that became considerably heavier when wet. A machine operator, usually a woman called a dipper, would physically push the bather beneath the waves if they seemed insufficiently committed. The whole arrangement was designed to deliver the health benefits of seawater without any of the aesthetic enjoyment that a modern beach visitor would recognize. The medical case for sea bathing was made by a physician named Richard Russell in 1753, and it was enthusiastic to the point of comprehensiveness. Russell prescribed seawater not just for bathing in, but for drinking, a practice that should trigger certain immediate biological objections, which is a subject his book addressed with less thoroughness than the benefits deserved. His central argument was that sea air and seawater had restorative properties for a range of conditions, and the English upper class, always receptive to a prescription that combined health with the acquisition of new property near the coast, embraced it with speed. Brighton, Scarborough, Eastbourne, and a dozen other coastal towns transformed themselves into resorts over the following century. The railway, arriving in the 1840s and 1850s, extended the seaside to the middle class, and shortly afterward to the working class, which required the resorts to recalibrate their offerings and the upper class to recalibrate their seaside locations. The The bathing machine was a genuine feat of Victorian problem-solving applied to a problem that was largely self-created. The problem was that mixed bathing, men and women in the water at the same time, in states of partial undress, was considered improper. The solution was to mechanize the process of entering the water in a way that preserved separation and concealment at every stage. You entered the machine on the beach. The machine was drawn by horse into the water to a depth of approximately 4 feet. You descended the steps at the seaward end into the water, and you bathed in a zone of privacy defined by the machine's walls and the rope attached to its side. The dipper, standing in the water beside you, encouraged total immersion on the grounds that a brief full submersion was considered more medically effective than a gentle paddle. Women's bathing costumes were designed on the same principle as the bathing machine: maximum coverage combined with theoretical functionality. The heavy wool dress, accompanied by stockings and sometimes shoes, provided warmth and modesty, while simultaneously absorbing enough water when wet to constitute a drowning hazard in deep water. Bathing bonnets were worn to keep the hair dry, in the same spirit in which the entire exercise was conducted, obtaining the benefits of the sea while minimizing the sea's contact with the actual person. The beach, for those remaining on shore, was conducted with comparable regulation. Parasols were carried to block direct sunlight. Donkeys were ridden with an expression suggesting this was a dignified activity. Pier concerts were attended. Shellfish were purchased from vendors and consumed with the barely audible pleasure of people eating things they enjoyed in public. The Victorian seaside was not, by modern standards, a particularly relaxed experience. But it was a holiday, and in a culture that had not previously possessed the concept of the holiday as a democratic institution, even a wool bathing costume and a horse-drawn privacy hut represented something that had not existed before: permission to stop. Working-class Victorian children were, in many households, introduced to alcohol at an age that would today prompt an immediate referral to social services. Gin was cheap, far cheaper than food in many cases, and widely available in the early Victorian era from shops that stayed open all hours and asked no questions about the age of the customer or the size of the glass. Children were given small amounts to keep them quiet, to help them sleep, and in some cases simply because there was nothing else in the house that was safe to drink. The water supply in many urban areas was contaminated enough that weak alcohol was genuinely less dangerous, a logic that had served every previous generation and continued to serve this one despite the mounting evidence of what routine alcohol consumption was doing to families, communities, and the general productivity of several city districts. The temperance movement spent much of the Victorian era pointing this out at volume. The gin shops remained open. The gin craze that had devastated the urban poor of the preceding century had technically subsided by Victoria's reign, but cheap spirits remained a central feature of working-class urban life throughout the period. The Gin Palace, elaborate, brightly lit, architecturally impressive, was a deliberate design strategy. Gin shops invested in mirrors, gas lighting, mahogany counters, and ornamental glass to create an environment that was demonstrably more comfortable than the homes of their customers. For a penny or two you could stand in a room that was warm, dry, bright, and not sharing the space with 7 other people and a goat. The appeal, viewed from the baseline of a working-class Victorian tenement, is not difficult to understand. The children in these environments were not edge cases. Contemporary observers and social reformers documented children in gin palaces as a routine observation, present with parents or sent alone to collect a jug of gin for the household. George Cruikshank's famous engravings in The Bottle, published in 1847, traced the destruction of a working-class family through alcohol in a sequence of images that begins with a single glass shared at a celebratory moment and ends with the mother in an asylum, the father in prison for murder, and the children destitute. The images were enormously popular. They were used as temperance propaganda. The gin palaces continued to fill. The temperance movement was one of the major social forces of the Victorian era, and it cut across class and political lines with unusual breadth. Middle-class moral reformers, nonconformist churches, early trade unionists, and eventually large numbers of working-class people themselves signed the pledge. a formal commitment to total abstinence through organisations like the Band of Hope and the British Women's Temperance Association. The Band of Hope specifically targeted children, organising meetings, concerts and educational events designed to instill abstinence values before alcohol had an opportunity to establish itself as normal. Children who attended Band of Hope meetings received cards, sang songs, and were presented with vivid accounts of what alcohol did to families. Many took the pledge as children and kept it. The Licensing Act of 1872 introduced closing hours for pubs and set the legal framework for restricting the trade, though the restrictions were modest, and the legal minimum drinking age for spirits was not set at 18 until 1923. The idea that children should be legally protected from access to alcohol arrived, as most Victorian child protections did, considerably later than the documentation of the harm. Between the gin palaces and the soothing syrups and the laudanum and the small beer given at breakfast for safety rather than pleasure, Victorian childhood was conducted in a pharmaceutical landscape that viewed the chemical management of small people as both practical and unremarkable. The remarkable thing, in retrospect, is how clearly the harm was documented at the time, and how consistently the documentation and the practice coexisted without one eliminating the other. A Victorian dinner party was not a casual gathering. It was a performance, governed by rules of such precise complexity that etiquette manuals dedicated substantial chapters to it, and middle-class hostesses studied those chapters like exam material. Guests were ranked and seated according to social hierarchy, and arriving out of order, sitting in the wrong place, or being seen to eat the wrong food with the wrong implement in the wrong sequence was a social failure that could be discussed for weeks. There was a correct fork for fish and a different correct fork for meat, and using one when you should have used the other was the kind of error that got you quietly crossed off invitation lists. Conversation was governed too. Certain topics were forbidden at the table, including money, religion, politics, and anything that could be construed as disagreeable. The goal was not to communicate, but to perform civilization convincingly for a period of several hours, after which everyone could go home and say what they actually thought. The invitation itself was the first performance. A properly written dinner invitation specified the date, the hour, and occasionally the dress expectation, and was written on good paper in a clear hand and delivered with sufficient notice to allow the recipient to accept or decline in writing. Also on good paper, also in a clear hand, within a day or two of receipt. Accepting and then failing to appear was a significant social transgression. Declining and then appearing somewhere else that evening, where the hosts might hear of it, was worse. The Victorians maintained a vast internal ledger of social obligations and infractions that modern life, with its casual cancellations and last-minute texts, would find utterly exhausting, and the Victorians found simply normal. The seating arrangement was the hostess's most demanding task. Guests were ranked by title, then by social standing, then by the internal hierarchies of the local community, and seated accordingly, the most senior gentleman escorting the hostess into the dining room, the second most senior escorting the second most senior lady, and so on down the table in an order that communicated to every person present exactly where they stood relative to everyone else. Getting the order wrong offended the person who had been ranked lower than they believed themselves to deserve. Getting it right required the hostess to have a precise and current understanding of the social standing of every person invited, including any recent changes in fortune, title, or reputation that might have altered the calculation since the last time she had assembled this particular combination of guests. The table itself was architectural. A formal Victorian dinner table featured more implements per place setting than most modern kitchens contain in total. Multiple forks arranged in order of use from the outside in, multiple knives, multiple spoons, specific glasses for specific wines, a finger bowl, a bread plate, and in ambitious households a selection of specialized implements for specific foods. Fish knives, oyster forks, asparagus tongs, marrow scoops. The rule was to work from the outside inward through the courses, but knowing which outside implement corresponded to which course required either experience or careful observation of what the person next to you was doing, which was itself considered slightly gauche, if done too, obviously. Conversation moved in a specific pattern. You spoke to the person on your left for the first part of the meal, then turned to the person on your right for the second part, a rotation managed by the hostess, who signaled the turn. Speaking across the table was acceptable in moderation. Speaking over someone was not. Raising your voice was not. Discussing your own health in detail was considered tedious. Discussing the health of others in detail was considered gossip, which was both forbidden at the table and the primary activity of every gathering. The distinction between acceptable social observation and forbidden gossip was one of tone and direction rather than content, and navigating it successfully was one of the core competencies of Victorian social life. After dinner, the women withdrew to the drawing room, while the men remained at the table with port and cigars, a separation so standard it required no explanation and received none. The women's drawing room conversation was understood to be lighter, the men's table conversation more substantive. Though observers who recorded both reported that the actual content was roughly equivalent in frivolity, the men simply having the advantage of port. Victorian London's East End was home to a collection of establishments that sold prepared opium to be smoked, places that became known. Through a combination of genuine reporting and spectacular journalistic embellishment, as opium dens. These rooms were real, they were legal, and they catered to a broader clientele than the lurid accounts suggested. Writers, intellectuals, and the occasional curious middle-class visitor came alongside the dock workers and the desperately addicted, drawn by a mixture of genuine appetite and the frisson of slumming. The Victorian practice of visiting poor areas for the experience of contrast. Charles Dickens wrote about them. Oscar Wilde put one in a novel. Journalists wrote breathless accounts of the horrors within, which drove more curious readers to find out for themselves. The opium trade, meanwhile, was not some underground operation. Britain had literally fought 2 wars with China in the previous decades to protect its right to sell opium into the Chinese market. The Victorian relationship with opiates was, in short, morally complicated in ways that the era preferred not to examine too closely. The Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856 are worth pausing on, because they represent one of the more striking instances of Victorian moral compartmentalization. The East India Company, and later the British government directly, oversaw the production of opium in Bengal and its export to China, despite explicit Chinese attempts to prohibit the trade. When Chinese authorities seized and destroyed British opium stocks in 1839, Britain went to war to restore the trade. The official justification was free trade and the rights of British merchants. The product being traded was a narcotic that the Chinese government had prohibited specifically because of the addiction and social damage it was causing to its population. Britain won both wars. The trade continued. At home, meanwhile, opium was legal, available, and widely used. The domestic opium den existed at the intersection of genuine addiction, immigrant community life. Many of the establishments in Limehouse were run by Chinese sailors and merchants who had settled in the East End, and the middle-class Victorian appetite for exotic experience in a safe enough frame to be retrieved from. Journalists went to opium dens and wrote about it. Their articles were vivid, sometimes accurate, and consistently framed around the contrast between the visiting narrator and the degraded regulars, a narrative structure that placed the reader securely on the side of the observers rather than the observed. The reality of the establishments was considerably less dramatic than the accounts suggested. Most were rooms in private houses or above shops, furnished with low platforms on which customers reclined, equipped with the pipes and prepared opium required for the purpose, and operated as small businesses by proprietors who charged for the product and the space. They were not, by the standards of Victorian entertainment options, particularly sensational. The theatre of the opium den existed largely in the prose of the people who wrote about it, for readers who had not been. What the opium den represented, culturally, was a visible concentration of a habit that was otherwise distributed invisibly through the population, in the laudanum bottles in medicine cabinets, in the soothing syrups for children, in the prescriptions for nervous ladies in respectable households. The East End opium smoker was visible, foreign, and poor. The respectable Victorian opium consumer was private, domestic, and purchasing from a pharmacy. The distinction the era drew between them was not chemical. Thomas de Quincey had said as much in 1821, describing his own laudanum consumption in terms that made the parallel unavoidable. The Victorian reading public found his account fascinating, somewhat scandalous, and largely irrelevant to their own medicine cabinets. It was easier to locate the opium problem in Limehouse than in the parlour, and the Victorian talent for that particular kind of relocation was considerable. If there is one thing that sanitised period dramas consistently fail to convey about Victorian England, it is the smell, not the polite background smell of a slightly musty house. The industrial, biological, deeply committed smell of a city of several million people, most of whom did not have access to regular bathing, adequate sanitation, or any mechanism for removing the byproducts of daily life from the immediate vicinity of where they were produced. Streets were shared with horses, tens of thousands of working horses in London alone, whose contributions to the street surface were constant, substantial, and not always promptly removed. Slaughterhouses operated in residential areas. Tanneries, which processed animal hides using urine and dung, operated near rivers. Factories burned coal continuously. The Thames served simultaneously as water source, sewage outlet, and industrial dumping ground. And in summer, when the temperature rose and the river sank, the combination of all these elements produced an atmospheric experience that visitors from rural areas reportedly found physically disorienting on first encounter. The horse problem was enormous in ways that are now difficult to appreciate, because the horse has been removed from urban life so completely that we no longer think of it as an infrastructure problem. London, in 1890, had approximately 50,000 working horses pulling cabs, omnibuses, delivery wagons, private carriages, brewery drays, postal vans, and every other vehicle that moved through the city. Each horse produced between 15 and 35 pounds of manure per day, which accumulated on road surfaces and was managed by a workforce of crossing sweepers, often children, who cleared paths through it for pedestrians in exchange for tips. On dry days, the manure dried and became dust, which circulated through the air and settled on every surface, including food being sold from street stalls. On wet days, it became a liquid compound of mud and organic matter that soaked through shoes and adhered to the hems of long skirts with reliable efficiency. The crossing sweeper was one of the city's most visible poor workers, stationed at busy intersections, broom in hand, dependent entirely on the generosity of passers-by for income. Henry Mayhew recorded their testimony in the 1850s, children who had been sweeping the same crossing since they were old enough to hold a broom, whose entire economic world was an area of perhaps 30 feet of roadway that they kept clear in exchange for coins from people who barely looked at them. Their earnings varied wildly with the weather, the foot traffic, and the moods of the prosperous. A good day near a fashionable shopping street might yield enough for a meal and a night's lodging. A bad day in the rain yielded nothing. The slaughterhouse situation was a separate atmospheric layer. Victorian London's abattoirs were not industrial facilities located at a sanitary distance from the population. They were neighbourhood businesses, tucked between houses and shops in working-class districts, conducting their operations in conditions that meant the surrounding streets experienced the sounds, smells, and frequently the physical evidence of the process at close range. The removal of live animals through city streets to reach these facilities added to the general sensory texture of the urban experience. Personal hygiene, in the absence of running hot water in most households, required effort and planning significant enough that it was simply not performed with the frequency that modern sensibilities consider standard. A full bath involved heating water over a fire, filling a portable tub, and then disposing of the water afterward, a process that might be undertaken weekly at best, less frequently in winter, and sometimes not at all during periods of illness or extreme poverty. The cumulative effect of all of this was an urban atmosphere that was simply, constantly, and comprehensively present to the senses in a way that modern cities, with their sealed buildings, filtered air, and chemical street cleaning, are not. Victorian Londoners were not oblivious to it. They complained about it constantly. They simply had no immediate remedy, and so they lived inside it, day after day, the way you eventually stop noticing a sound that never stops. The Victorian patent medicine industry operated on a philosophy of radical optimism. If you had a bottle, a label, and a sufficiently confident name, you could sell almost anything to almost anyone for almost any complaint, because neither consumer protection laws nor pharmaceutical regulation existed to complicate the transaction. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething children contained morphine and alcohol. Cocaine toothache drops, marketed specifically to children, contained cocaine. Dr. James's powder, sold for fevers, contained antimony, which is a heavy metal with a narrow margin between therapeutic and lethal dose. Radium water was sold in the 1900s as a health tonic, the logic being that radium was energetic and expensive, and therefore probably good for you. Godfrey's cordial, another popular children's medicine, contained enough opium to produce genuine dependence. These products were advertised in newspapers, endorsed by testimonials, and sold in respectable pharmacies alongside legitimate medications, with no requirement that anyone disclose what was actually in them. The testimonial was the cornerstone of patent medicine marketing, and it worked with a reliability that suggests the Victorians were either more trusting or more desperate than subsequent generations. Advertisements featured letters from grateful customers, clergymen, widows, retired military officers, describing in warm and specific detail how a particular preparation had cured them of precisely the complaint the reader currently experienced. The letters were sometimes genuine, sometimes invented, sometimes